Welcome to Nous, the podcast which tackles the deepest questions about the mind. You may have noticed I've been away for a little while. I had to take a break from making the podcast while I moved house and started a new job, but have no worries, I am back. I have been busy working on a new series, if you can call it that, with some phenomenal guests and interviews to share with you. It's good to be back. In this episode, I speak to someone whose work had a huge impact on me when I was first studying philosophy and psychology as an undergraduate. She's a philosopher who spends more time with neuroscientists than she does with other philosophers. And she is indeed the author of the seminal book Neurophilosophy, first published in 1986. Her most recent work, which we're going to be talking about today, is called Conscience, and it explores the evolution and neuroscience of moral intuition, purporting to show along the way what's so wrong with the major ethical theories in Western philosophy. Professor Patricia Churchland, welcome to Nous.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So, as I said, I'm really very, very pleased to have you on because when I was studying philosophy and psychology as an undergraduate, I came across your work and your husband's work, and it was a big influence on me. And I ended up writing my thesis on your work.
Oh, I'm so thrilled. Oh, that's so wonderful.
Well, yeah. I'm not sure you needed my help, but I was trying to defend eliminative materialism against arguments from multiple realizability.
Good. Yeah, no, good on you.
I want to sort of take us back to almost a very big and foundational question, which I think is going to feed into our discussion of your book, Conscience. And it was a topic that I got very excited about when I first started reading your work in the early 2000s. And it's the question of what philosophy is and what it's really doing. My understanding from years ago is that you think of philosophy as a kind of proto-science.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. And I think that when people called themselves natural philosophers, but what they were really doing were the things that, for example, Lavoisier was doing or Hooke was doing. They were trying to find out about the nature of things. They were trying to find out what fire is, for example, or they were trying to find out what the difference is between something that's alive and something that is dead. And they called themselves natural philosophers. But as you know, within the sort of history of all of this, chemistry kind of divided itself off from natural philosophy and became a discipline in its own right. And similarly, of course, with physics, and eventually also with biology and with psychology. And still, by the beginning, I guess, of the 20th century, there were many questions about the nature of the mind that remained unsolved, needless to say, by psychology or by biology. And some philosophers thought that these were questions that they would continue to work on. And some philosophers thought that the best way to work on those kinds of questions was to understand the deep meaning behind our use of language. And they thought that by analyzing what we mean by certain words, like consciousness or like perception, that we would get the deepest level of science, namely what this conceptual analysis showed consciousness to really be. But at the same time, there were philosophers who said, well, wait, I mean, we might mean that by consciousness. We might mean a certain thing, but it might be misleading or it might be wrong. Like when people thought that atoms were indivisible, it was part of the meaning of the word atom. Atom cannot be divided. And it turned out that actually, despite the meaning of the word, atoms are divisible. So that was kind of at the turn of the early part of the 20th century. And I think the more that progress was made in biology and the more progress that was made in psychology, the more the philosophers of the let's just analyze language school began to really take dominance. And that was sort of the way things were supposed to be done. You were supposed to be analyzing concepts.
And they're still around, right? I mean, I remember coming across a very sort of formidable tome in the early 2000s called the Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience by Peter Hacker.
Yeah. Case in point.
Yeah, he's a Wittgensteinian philosopher, and he had co-authored this with a neuroscientist. But really, what I discovered when I started looking at that book was that it was a lot of sort of ticking off neuroscientists for misusing language, almost.
Yes. You can't say the brain remembers.
Yes, yeah.
And yeah, it was sort of a language police book. And of course, some neuroscientists read it and thought, well, in a certain sense, maybe you're right, but the brain does remember. And they went on talking in the same old way, just as physicists went on saying, you know what, the atom might really be divisible. And the Peter Hackers of physics would say, no, it's not possible. You're misusing the word atom. We have to call it something else. And the trouble with language police is that, it never works. People say what they need to say and what the science bids them say. And if it's really stupid and outrageous, eventually they'll give it up. But if the science needs a formulation, it takes hold. And the language police from philosophy ain't going to make no difference.
And I mean, what was, I think, quite disappointing for me about it was that I had started becoming involved in philosophy and started studying philosophy because I thought it was going to give answers to big questions, not just clarify what sentences made sense and what sentences didn't make sense.
That's right.
And according to that vision of philosophy, the philosophers just clarify. They point out confusion, and they distinguish sense from nonsense. And it's the scientists finding out actual stuff about the world, which is interesting because it does, from the philosopher's point of view, at least it means you need a separate faculty, right? You've got your place and you've got your function and it's separate.
Yeah.
Is that perhaps a challenge for your kind of view of philosophy, perhaps for other philosophers, that you don't seem to guarantee a special place for philosophers, which may be right, but it's sort of threatening, isn't it?
I think it is. And, I might overstate the importance of the empirical sciences here, but on the other hand, what was really shocking to me and remains so is that many philosophers think that whatever the empirical sciences have to say, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant to what the mind really is. It's irrelevant to the nature of ethics. It's irrelevant to the deep, deep nature of our conceptual scheme, as they're fond of saying, and so they talk to each other. And they make finer and finer distinctions that nobody in the sciences gives a tinker's damn about because it doesn't do anything. And so many subdomains of philosophy have all kinds of isms. If you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and look under epistemology, you'll find isms up the yin-yang. And similarly with moral philosophy, there's internalism and externalism. There's realism and there's blah, 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 and there's and sometimes when I give a talk, some poor moral philosophy graduate student says, "But are you an internalist realist?" And I don't even know what the heck that is. I mean, it's not worth knowing anymore. And so I kind of agree with you that at least some part of philosophy kind of lost sight of what they were doing, of what the questions they should be asking really were. And the other thing that I think some philosophers what happened was that they were just intellectually very, very narrow. They did not want to know. They did not want to know what neuroscience was doing. They did not want to have to learn that stuff, cells, neurotransmitters. They didn't want to learn it. So they went back and they read Hegel yet again. And they talked about Hegel's theory of the da-da-da and how it was different from Brentano's theory of the la-li-la. And somehow they're getting paid for this.
Oh, this is too much fun.
Yeah, I know, and I think it's a disaster for philosophy because I think there is a real thing to be done, and there are really good philosophers doing really good things, like Walter Sinnott Armstrong and Owen Flanagan, to just start by mentioning two, and in England, I think Julian Savulescu is doing really good and important and wonderful work. It may not be things I agree with all the time, but at least it's real stuff. He's not just sort of, as my students would say, he's not just pulling it out of his ass.
By real stuff, you mean it's engaged with the empirical sciences, but it's also of practical import and relevance. Is that?
Yes. And it's not hiding behind masses of jargon, which many philosophers do. You can't, if you go to some of the leading journals and try to read the papers, it's so full of jargon about all these various isms and so on that unless you spend a huge amount of time kind of entering that vocabulary, you don't understand the paper. And if you do spend that time, you realize the paper is completely trivial and uninteresting. And I'm sorry to say that. And this is why so many philosophers, really hate me. But it's the truth. What can I say?
Well, that brings us on to your book. So this is Conscience, The Origins of Moral Intuition. Is accessible. It is definitely written for a broad audience in mind.
Yeah, it is. It's meant to be. Yeah.
And you are trying to address how moral intuition evolved and looking at the neurobiological underpinnings of our sort of moral systems, or our systems that influence moral judgments. Let's just put that in context. So we've talked about what your vision of philosophy is. How does this fit in as an exercise of like philosophy as proto-science? How does that fit into this overall program?
Well, I think there are kind of two questions that need to be separated at the outset. And one is whether neuroscience in and of itself can tell us about what is right and what is wrong. And there, I think the answer is no. I mean, of course, science can give us all kinds of information that is important to take into account when we're making a moral decision. But ultimately, science can't say doing X is wrong and doing Y is right. So that's one thing. And it's important for me to say that because in some of the reviews already, the philosophers who have reviewed this book have said, she thinks that, science is going to tell us what's right and wrong, but only philosophers can do that. And so it's really important for me to kind of get that out to begin with. Now, the other question, and this is the one I'm really interested in, is where does moral motivation come from? I mean, after all, we are biological creatures. And we're very complex biological creatures. So this is kind of like the question that Thrasymachus used to irritate Socrates with. And that was, why should I be moral? And in a way, I think it has very deep philosophical implications because the recent work in neuroscience about why should I be moral, and that is because it's really part of our nature, and that being social is an extremely important part of our nature, and that it's an important part of what goes into our mental and our physical health, and that some people answered through Symmachus, some philosophers answered through Symmachus by saying, well, it's very satisfying to do the right thing and to do good things and to help other people. And other philosophers who are, shall we say, of a purist persuasion said, oh no, if you do the right thing, if you help other people because you derive satisfaction from it, or because it makes you feel closer to your community, that's not real morality. Real morality has to be pure. Mm-hmm. Now, wherever that came from, I don't know, but Socrates mightily scoffed at it, and so do I. So I was just really interested in what it could be neurobiologically that makes not just humans, but mammals in general and birds in general social, and why morality, as we think of it, is really a subset of sociality that has to do with incurring a cost to yourself in order to benefit another. And I never really expected in my lifetime to see neurobiological progress on those questions. So it surprised the heck out of me when the data began to come in.
So let's see if we can sketch a few of the elements of the story that you tell. It starts with why did we become social creatures? That's a sort of core question, since morality is a sort of repercussion of being social and living in societies. And you start actually with what might sound surprising, the evolution of warm-bloodedness.
Yeah.
Right. Now, why is that important?
Well, it took me a long time to see why it was important. But the thing is this, that when warm-blooded animals appeared on the planet, it was a tremendous advantage because they could forage at night when the cold-blooded animals had to wait for the sun to come up. And they could also forage in less warm climates. And that was a tremendous thing. But of course, in biology, there's always a cost. And the cost is that gram for gram, a warm-blooded creature has to eat about 10 times as much as a cold-blooded cousin. And that puts tremendous ecological pressure on warm-blooded animals. And so in evolutionary terms, animals who were more adept or more clever, shall we say, or more smart, had one way of compensating for this tremendous calorie need that they had to have. They also developed fur, and that helped as well. But the important thing is that from our perspective, the thing that really mattered was that mammals developed a new structure in the brain, never before seen on the planet, and that was cortex. And cortex allowed them to store tremendous amounts of information, to integrate information. And it relied, of course, on the old ancient subcortical structures for motivation and sleep-waking patterns and so forth. But it allowed them a kind of abstraction, a kind of predictive prowess that we had not seen hitherto on the planet. So that was really important, but there was a cost. Cortex comes with a cost. And the cost is really interesting because it's related to a fundamental biological fact. And the fact is that you can't have memory for anything unless you build structure on the neuron. And so if I am going to learn, for example, that a certain kind of animal is ferocious and to be avoided, my brain has to build some structure. So why is that interesting? Well, it turns out that there are limits on how much structure you could build. And if you're going to get smart by your brain tuning itself up to the environment, your brain has to be super immature when you're born. So, I remember actually on the farm, my dad saying to me one day, don't you think it's funny that when rattlesnakes are hatched. They just come out of the egg and off they go. They fend for themselves. But when mammalian babies are born, they're completely dependent. It's like biology regressed, and humans are tremendously dependent. They're absolutely hopeless. All they can really do is digest.
Yes.
And make racket. What's interesting about this immaturity at birth is that it means there has to be, in evolutionary terms, a caregiver. So somewhere along the line, there had to be changes in the mammalian brain so that the mammalian mother took care of the offspring. And she doesn't do it because it's fun and so forth. She does it because her wiring ensures that she does it. Now, her wiring makes her feel that this is wonderful. Her wiring makes her feel that these babies are the most beautiful things she's ever seen. But if that wiring isn't there, she does not care. She's like a salamander, or she's like a mother garter snake. She doesn't care. So basically, evolution favored mothers that cared. And of course, eventually that can be tweaked. The genes that are responsible for that wiring can be tweaked in various ways so that the father cares as well, and so forth. Yeah. So that's kind of the sweet evolutionary story that begins with being warm-blooded, needing food, getting smart, but then having to have an immature brain, and then having to have a brain that cares for offspring.
Okay, so we've now got to sort of, I guess, family units there.
Yes.
Does that story also sort of add pressure to cooperate in terms of, so if animals are getting smarter in order to cope with the additional calorific demands of being warm-blooded, is that a pressure influencing cooperation, or does that come via other mechanisms?
I think we don't really know. And certainly I don't know. I think some aspects of cooperation are probably like empathy. They're probably part of the basic wiring that you get when you're born. But on the other hand, there are many aspects of cooperation that are learned. And just as empathy and caring provides a kind of basic platform for being social, the precise nature that sociality takes, whether you live in this kind of community or that kind, or have these sorts of norms or those sorts, that's all learned. But what that means is that but if you didn't have that platform there, you wouldn't learn the norms or rules either. And pure reason, for example, wouldn't get you anywhere, Okay,
well, we're gonna get to the pure reason.
Okay.
Yes, we will. We will. But most of the story we've got so far, and correct me if I'm wrong, but would that not equally apply to chimpanzees, for example?
Yes, and it does.
So they have family units.
Yeah.
They are totally helpless as infants.
Absolutely.
As newborns. So all of this applies to them, but they're an order of magnitude less sophisticated as a society in their cognitive skills, and presumably also do they have kinds of behaviors that you regard as moral?
Yes, they do. And I think we owe much to the animal behavior people for teaching us this. Franz de Waal, Christoph Besch, but many other people, Shirley Strum, and of course Jane Goodall. But the kinds of basic behaviors I have in mind are things like consolation of a friend after a defeat, grieving for the dead, cooperation. Cooperation amongst male chimpanzees in hunting monkeys has been very well demonstrated. And if I may take a non-primate example, cooperation amongst wolves is just stunning. Absolutely remarkable how they work together to do something very difficult, like bring down a caribou.
Yes.
And So I think in non-human animals, wolves, and as well as primates, but even also rodents, we know that if you set up the experimental conditions or set up the observational conditions, you will see it. So let me tell you a rodent story, which I think is one of the most surprising stories because it's a rodent. You know, we think, oh, well, you know, rodents, they have all the same brain structures we have. So anyway, here's the rodent story. So rodents, of course, rats don't like to go into open spaces. You know, if you've got a rat in your kitchen, it's going to hug the wall. It's not going to wander into the open space. So thing one is they don't like that. Now, here's the experiment. So you have a big, wide open space, and in the middle of the space, you have a plexiglass trap. And you take a rat and you stuff it into this plexiglass tube, and there is a mechanism on one end for opening the tube. The rat does not like to be confined. Now, step two, you take the rat's pal and you put it into the space, and it hugs the wall. But it also hears its pal. And eventually, after only a few minutes, it does what it does not want to do. It goes into the open space and tries to get the rat out. And it monkeys with the mechanism, and it works it and works it and works it. And eventually, it gets out. And the two of them embrace. Okay, that's a very sophisticated bit of helping behavior. And you might think, oh, well, you know, it just didn't like the squeaking noise. So now here's the next step. This was done in Peggy Mason's lab in Chicago. So then you take some food.
Yeah.
Some nice chocolate chips, and you put it in at one corner of the open space. What does the rat do this time? So you stuff the pal into the tube. In comes the friend, knows the food is there, works, releases the rat, and then they both go and they both eat. It could have gone first and eaten all, and then come and didn't do that. Now, here's the third part of the story, which philosophers hate, but it's a fact. So these two rats in this experiment know each other. They've been housed together. So suppose you take a rat that is unknown and you stuff him into the tube and let friend come, you know, the old rat that knows how to release. What does he do? He doesn't do anything. So the rat in the tube, the stranger rat, is squeaking and saying, get me out of here, get me out of here. And the one who knows how to release hugs the perimeter of the space. Now, if you then take out strange rat, house it together with knowledgeable rat, and 2 days later you repeat the experiment, now knowledgeable rat will release the stranger.
Okay.
Now they're friends, they can do it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this teaches us something about attachment and about the importance of knowing who the other person is or who the other individual is if you're going to help. And this is just biology, and this is just a rat. So your question really was, so what, you know, we're obviously more sophisticated than a chimpanzee. What's the difference? You know, do we have a special moral center that makes us really, you know? No. We just have more neurons. That's all. It's just more neurons. I mean, people think, oh, maybe we've got a special neuron. And for a while, there was this hot story about von Economo neurons that are only in humans. Well, they're not. They're in dolphins. They're in elephants. They're in all kinds of creatures. No. We have the same brain structures. Our neurons are more densely packed than those in the rodent brain. But we just have more neurons. We are fundamentally biological creatures. We're not just rodents, although I sometimes joke that I'm just a big hairless rat. But and in some respects, that's true. with regard to my babies, I probably responded very much as a mother rat did.
Interesting. So one of the guests I have interviewed on the podcast previously is a thinker called Raymond Tallis. I don't know if you've come across his work.
Oh, yeah.
And he, it's interesting that, you're saying the difference between chimpanzees and humans is that we just have more neurons.
So far as we can tell. I mean, it's not, there are many things we don't know, but that's how it looks.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. So for Ray, he wanted to talk about certain faculties that he regards as so fundamentally different, he cannot see how neuroscience or evolution could ever give us an account of how you get between the two. A very unsatisfying story, but he wanted to point to things like our sense of time, which he has all sorts of elaborate arguments as to why. But it's very interesting, and he also wanted to point to elements of shared intentionality that he thinks are very sort of an order different in humans. But that's absolutely not something you have any truck with. There are vast differences, obviously.
Sure.
Language, tool use, culture, incredibly sophisticated behavioral repertoire. But it's just down to more neurons as far as we know.
Well, but let me qualify that. That is that more neurons can also mean that out of a quantitative change, you can get certain qualitative changes. I mean, that happens in science everywhere, right? So we know that. But ultimately, yes, we just have more neurons so far as we can tell. Now, that makes for orders of magnitude greater connectivity. And as we know, here, let me give you an example of quantitative differences making a qualitative difference, and that's in AI. When Jeff Hinton was first working with artificial neural nets, they were neural nets with maybe 1,000, if he was lucky, units with maybe 5,000 connections. And they could do something that they couldn't do very much. Just now, make many, many more of those, make millions of units, make many millions of connections with many, many, many layers instead of just 3. And can the network do new things? And the answer is, you bet. And now we have the AI revolution. So we know that you can get much more remarkable things once you make your network really big. A 3-layer network cannot recognize faces, cannot play poker. But just expand that sucker and it can.
It can. Okay, fantastic. So let's get on to these purveyors of pure reason.
Oh, the pure reason, yes.
So towards the end of the book, you start sort of applying what you've told us, the sort of story you've told us about evolution and the neurobiological underpinnings and the psychological mechanisms that underpin moral intuitions. And then you start thinking about how are these relevant, and how do these undermine the kind of ethical theories that have been dominant in Western philosophy for a long time, and kind of still are, I think. And that is utilitarianism and Kantian ethics, deontological ethics, which is all about duty and a rational consideration of duty. So what is it that neuroscience has to teach us that's relevant to establishing whether, for example, utilitarianism is right? How can that descriptive scientific domain tell us that utilitarianism is wrong?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I don't think you need any neuroscience to show the flaws in utilitarianism. I think, for example, Simon Blackburn has done just a stunning job, along with many other people, of showing the flaws in utilitarianism. So that's one thing. But the additional point that I wanted to make was this, and that is that utilitarians usually say that an essential principle of utilitarianism is that every individual counts equally. That when you are making a moral decision, nobody, whether they're part of your family or your friend or not, nobody counts for any more than anybody else. And so the claim has been that if it, and so here's the obvious way to challenge this is that does that entail that I should care more about 10 homeless people than my own mother? And the answer is yes. They collectively outweigh her. And similarly with regard to my children. And that, long before I knew any neuroscience, I just thought that was really a remarkably obtuse thing to claim. People can't act that way.
Yeah.
Now, there's another claim that's related to that, that utilitarians are pushing very hard on right now, and that is that not only emotional distance shouldn't matter, but spatial distance shouldn't matter. Your own community shouldn't matter any more than some community way off on the other side of the planet. Now, we know that belonging to a community, participating in the community, being a volunteer for the kids' soccer team, that those things matter tremendously to people. And they matter to the community, which means that there is this wonderful feedback. And community is extremely important to people's mental and physical health. So, for example, I know a woman who is a hairdresser. And one day a week, she goes down into the downtown part of San Diego where the homeless folks hang out, and she cuts their hair. Now, I could say to her, why don't you really sort of do the utilitarian calculation? And I think you'll find that in Sierra Leone, there are 20 people whose need is greater, and you should send them money and not do this.
So this is sounding like the effective altruist movement.
It is the effect, yes.
It does these calculations, yeah.
And I think that it's proposed or promoted by people who have no understanding of the importance of community and no understanding of how dreadful it has been, for example, in the United States, when community is hollowed out by unemployment, by poverty, by drugs, when people no longer coach the boys' soccer team or the girls' hockey team, when they no longer attend church and no longer provide food suppers for, the neighbors who are struggling. The cost is tremendous. And many, many sociologists and psychologists, I think, are sort of looking at effective altruism and thinking, what on earth are these people thinking? I mean, do they actually know anything about living in a community and what that means to people? So I think it's actually a bit of an abomination, to tell you the truth.
It's interesting. I mean, I think isn't there to perhaps put up a bit of a fight. I did once have a really interesting conversation with I think a professor at Oxford called Hilary Greaves, who is an effective altruist, but who pointed out to me that you don't have to be a utilitarian to be an effective altruist.
Sure.
Yeah. And the point she was making is that you can accept that the consequences of an action matter. You can accept that that's relevant, and you would accept that that's relevant to evaluating the ethical value of a particular action. The consequences matter, but the problem with utilitarianism is saying it's all that matters. But an effective altruist isn't necessarily committed to saying consequences are the only thing that matters, but they are committed to trying to maximize the value of the consequences of their charitable activity. But I think, I take your point that it is at the expense of community, because It's about finding where you can have greatest impact, regardless of whether it's your own family or some other country.
Yeah, yeah. And there is something I think deeply bizarre about that. I mean, one example that I use in the book is of the doctor who wants to, tootle off and join Doctors Without Borders and do all kinds of good. At the same time, he's leaving at home a wife who has MS and 3 children. But he thinks, he does his utilitarian calculation, and he thinks, I can do so much more good if I join Doctors Without Borders. And yet, I don't think it's unfair to judge him as rather heartless to do that.
Yes. Absolutely.
It's not that I don't think that the faraway needs are unimportant. It's just that I think we need to be very, very cautious about dissing people for taking care of their own, for taking care of community, for being involved in community because they are so motivated to do so. I mean, my haircutting friend, I don't think is motivated to do something for somebody in Eastern Mongolia, but she's very motivated to do something for people in San Diego. It makes her feel good. She feels part of the community. She's giving back to a place that she feels was good to her. And sometimes philosophers find those motives cheap. I'm too much of a country bumpkin to find them cheap. I don't think they're cheap. I think that's what keeps us decent.
Yes, yeah. Well, we're sort of fringing around the naturalistic fallacy here in the sense of where you're talking about human nature being a certain way, and the utilitarian theory denying that aspect of human nature. But isn't it about a normative aspiration of how we should be that the utilitarian theory is offering us, rather than an acknowledgement of how we are?
I think that's possible. I mean, I think Josh Green, for example, was it was put to him. He was challenged to say, "Look, you obviously care very deeply about your own children, and yet, you should take that money that's in their college fund and spread it around." And he said, "Look, it's an ideal. And I think the world would be a better place if we could act that way." To which I'm thinking, really? How do you know that? What entitles you to think that it would be a better place? So, I mean, there is a certain kind of utilitarian, and I'm not saying Josh is one, but there are certain kinds of utilitarians who actually scare me for the same reason that Lenin was scary. The argument for him was, shoot them. We're talking about the next generation. We're talking about masses of people, and these are just, 40 bureaucrats. Kill them. Wow, geez, when I was in Russia, we had some wonderful conversations with the philosophers, and we were talking about utilitarianism, and they basically call it Lenin's math, and for good reason.
Yeah.
And, Simon Blackburn pointed this out. He said really terrible things are done in the name of utilitarianism. Terrible things. So, of course, I mean, it as Aristotle and everybody since, and certainly Hume knew, the consequences matter. Of course they matter. On the other hand, a rule that says you have to maximize aggregate utility and that everyone counts equally is really not going to cut it.
Yeah. So let's just hone down a bit more explicitly on the relationship between, I guess, the descriptive and the normative, what is and what ought to be.
Yeah.
So am I right in understanding that the sort of argument you're making in the book is that certain facts about human nature and human psychology, which we can also explore through understanding how we evolved moral intuitions and understanding the neurobiological basis of moral judgment, certain facts about those constrain the kind of ethical theories that we should adopt or that work. So that's not the same as saying facts about the brain tell us about what should be the case.
Yes.
It's the facts about human biology and neurology tell us what theories might be workable. It constrains the space of what's an acceptable ethical theory.
I think that's a good way of putting it. That's the way I like to put it. And I think it means that the naturalistic fallacy, as originally conceived by Moore, is kind of a misbegotten way of putting the problem.
Okay.
I don't think there is an easy way of saying our natural impulses are this, but we can see that those natural impulses have to be curbed by morality. We philosophers have figured out. I think it's just very messy. I mean, this is why Hume and Aristotle are so important. I mean, Hume, interestingly, talks about the importance of institutions and of norms and of realizing the importance of stability and prosperity and so forth. But at the same time, he understands that there is the moral sentiment. And he doesn't give forth with a sort of ideological, hard and fast line. And I don't know how to reconceive the naturalistic fallacy. You're a philosopher, or at least trained at one. There's a job for you. But it should be reconceived because I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but it's a mistake to think that whatever it was exactly that Moore said is what we need to adopt, and that we don't need to take any of our biological motivations too seriously. Because we can always say, well, why is that good? Why is it good to take care of your babies? Mm. If a person really can't see why it's good to take care of your own children, usually that's a wiring issue. Sometimes it's an acquired wiring issue because they're on drugs. And all of those wonderful endocannabinoids and their receptors are all messed up by opioids. And women don't take care. They don't feel it. They just don't care anymore. Mm. I just think morality is a lot harder than... I learned this from Aristotle and Hume. Morality is a lot harder than most moral philosophers think. They think that they just need to trot out some rules and defend them and, give us a few counterexamples and we're done. I think it's really, really, I think life is hard.
So, well, this brings us on to, you do offer what you call a first pass formulation, where it's a rough definition of morality, right? Mm-hmm. That you offer in the book. Would you call it a theory of morality?
No, it's not a theory. It's a rough first pass formulation. We know that the wiring for sociality has to be in place. We know that children pick up community standards. We also know that, like Aristotle and many others, the community standards aren't the be-all and the end-all, that sometimes we come to understand that the community standards need to change. Mm. And that's why I say it's a first-pass formulation. Very, very early on in the book, I think on page 3, I make the point that we often know that the community standards are unacceptable. And so we do work to change them. That's in Shakespeare. It's in everybody who's ever really thought deeply about moral issues.
Absolutely. So we're always in dialogue with each other and with the society around us about what is acceptable or right.
Absolutely.
So I guess, do you think...
So that's why it's messy. It would be great if there were what the Kantians want. The rule that we could just, emblazoned on everybody's house that says, this is what you have to do. But it isn't like that. And the Buddhists know this, Confucius knew this, Hume knew this. And it's hard. Nobody wants to really accept the fact that it's really, really messy. And often we don't know what the right thing to do is.
So how do you go about arguing for moral change? Because if there are no appeals to big overarching rules, if that whole attempt in Western philosophy is bunk and is failed, how do you make the case? What do you appeal to try and encourage people that certain attitudes or ideas? So historically, all sorts of values have changed.
Yes,
slavery, racism, feminism are all have all been addressed, tackled, campaigned against, and sometimes they've gone from minority causes and become majority and mainstream. So there are some mechanisms happening that are driving those changes. Is that just a matter of psychology and of I don't know, sort of contingent stuff happens essentially, or might there be sort of reasons? Or I mean, there can't be reasons, right? If all of these rule-giving theories are just doomed to failure.
Well, of course there can be reasons. I mean, people solve many kinds of practical problems. They solve practical problems about house building or about bridge building, but they also solve practical problems about how to get along when certain kinds of issues befall them. I don't like to say I'm a this or a that, but I mean, ultimately, Aristotle was right. These are practical problems. And if we romanticize morality and say, oh, no, we have to have a perfect ideology in order to solve these problems, we just get ourselves into a mess. So I think that if you had to say I'm anything, I guess I'm a pragmatist. And I think people often need to come together. They need to figure out how to make a situation work, how to deal with an impending disaster or the effects of a disaster, and how to move forward. And there's going to be big individual variability. And some people are going to want a quick fix, and some people are going to want a long fix, and also bear in mind that people change their minds slowly. Philosophers have this idea that if you want to convince somebody of the errors of the value that they hold, you just need to give them an argument and reason will take over. But we all know that's not true, right? That for the changes that we saw in my lifetime regarding homosexuality, for example, that didn't come about as a result of somebody trotting out a single argument. There were many, many social factors, not the least of which was, of course, events like Stonewall and events that happened in San Francisco. But it was also the recognition that celebrities like Rock Hudson were gay and were wonderful, decent, lovely people. And that someone's family member is gay and so forth. And I think it took a long time because that's part of how the brain works. That is that we don't change our minds too quickly about things that have very deep ramifications. So yeah, I think we kind of have to come together. We have to try to solve things in a practical way. And with regard to something like universal basic income. I mean, I know people who say, well, yeah, it's true. We don't know what the consequences are, but let's try it and see what happens. Well, geez, I think you got to do better than that. And I know other people who say it's just the decent thing to do. Well, where the heck does that come from? Yes. So I think the other side of it is that I don't think there are moral authorities. You know, I really don't. And I think that there are lots of just regular folks who are carpenters or farmers or whatever who are very grounded morally, and others who aren't. And the same is true within the academy and amongst philosophers. And Aristotle pointed out, it's easier to be a good person if you've been lucky in life. If you're not too poor and you didn't have a terrible disease and your children weren't too awful, it's easier to be a good person. He's right.
It's really striking, this idea. There are no moral authorities.
No, they're not.
And it connects with a book was published, which you contributed to, called Neuroexistentialism.
Oh, yeah. Owen Flanagan was the editor, I think, or one of the editors, Greg Caruso.
Yes, it was Owen Flanagan and Greg Caruso, exactly. And they talk about that we're in the age of neuroexistentialism. Mm-hmm. So if the first wave of existentialism was us losing faith in the idea that God was a sufficient ground of human value and meaning, the second wave was our capacity for reason isn't gonna give us what we want, and the third wave is that advances in neuroscience make us feel like our sense of agency, of free will, and of sort of transcendent value of moral choices or a moral instinct, that no longer is available to us. And the kind of response I was having to this, your claim, there are no moral authorities, is a kind of existential anxiety or something, damn, you there's no excuses. You just have to make it up as you go along. It's messy, you negotiate with each other, and that's it. That's all there is.
Yeah.
So I guess, are we right to be anxious?
No, I think not. I mean, Buddhists aren't anxious. They're not. And Confucians aren't anxious. That is, we don't need that. It's like, learning cosmology and learning physics and realizing there's no such thing as absolute downness. It's all relative to the center of gravity.
Right.
Well, it doesn't make me anxious. I don't suddenly start falling down stairs and tipping over ladders and getting weak in the knees when I see an escalator and so forth. The world is a complicated place. And I think Hume understood that there are no moral authorities, and it didn't seem to trouble him over much. He seemed to be a relatively sort of upbeat kind of guy. So, I mean, it's not that there aren't some people who are sort of morally more worth talking to, I think. I'm sure Hume would have always been very worth talking to. And probably Jerry Falwell is not worth talking to. He's the evangelical preacher.
He's the one with who's told us that God wanted him to have a private jet. Is that him?
Yeah. I think that's awfully nice.
Yeah.
But there are many very thoughtful people, and they're not. And some of them are, really, really widely read, even though they may not be, in a philosophy department, who have very significant things to say when it comes to deciding what happens in a community, when certain kinds of decisions have to be made. Are we going to cut the old growth forest, or aren't we? And we have to compromise, we have to come together, we have to listen to each other, and we have to make a decision. And we can't be sure that because we've done it all with, good hearts, that we've made the right decision. It might end up being the wrong decision.
And that's perhaps a bracing but practical message to end with. Yeah.
Social life is hard. I watched a video yesterday involving our bay here where we live on Bowen Island in the summer. And the boat was out in the Howe Sound and encountered a large group of orcas. And it was very clear that they were after a sea lion. And the sea lion tried to get in the guy's boat. And then the sea lion just hung right close to the keel of the boat. And the guy thought, well, geez, this is really dinner for the orcas. And yet, there's the sea lion. What do I do? He knew that if he just puttered slowly to the shoreline, that the sea lion would escape, which he ultimately did. But he said, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing.
Yes.
I don't know what else to do. I have to do something I can live with. And I think there's other food out there for the orcas, but I don't know if I'm doing the right thing or not. And life is often like that.
Yeah.
And we have to carry on as best we can. I think as long as you aren't sort of overtly corrupt and overtly horrible, that doing the best you can is kind of our lot.
That's it. So, listeners, do the best you can. I'll post the links to Patricia's book in the show notes. See if you can get hold of a copy and see what you think. Patricia Churchland, thank you very much for speaking with me.
Thanks so much. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. Yeah, really wonderful. Thank you. Do I sound like a warm, loving grandmother that you would just totally believe?
Absolutely. You could say whatever you want.
Oh, good.